Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So I'd like to welcome everyone this evening, offer my greetings to you all. I know again, uh, Saturday evening in the summertime is not always everyone's favorite time to get together like this, or a time a lot of people may be busy. So again, I'm glad that people were able to come. So right now we're just counting down days until the beginning of the rains retreat, or in Pali, it's called the Wasa. In Thai, it's the Pansa. And so between today and the next time we get together, the next Saturday, we're going to have the Asalha Puja, and we're going to have the beginning of Pansa. So we aren't actually getting together on Asalha Puja. So I thought I'd maybe speak a little bit about this today, because this is considered to be one of the main Buddhist holy days, or one of the most important days of the year in the Buddhist calendar. So the most important day, or the which we usually hold as our biggest day of the year, is Visakha Puja, which has passed already. So that was for the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and passing away, his death, his parinibbana. And then we have in earlier in the year in February, we have Magha Puja, which is to commemorate this time when 1,250 enlightened monks all got together to pay respects to the Buddha, and he gave them the Ovada Patimokkha. But so today, or in a few days, will be Asalaha Puja. So this is the day before the rains retreat starts. And this is, again, a very important day. And so this is the time when the Buddha gave his first teaching, his first sermon. So after the Buddha became enlightened, so back on Visakha Puja, um, he at first he was like, he wasn't sure if he was going to teach. He was like, this was really difficult to understand. This is really deep, like heavy stuff. Like it's really, most people won't understand it. And then the Brahma Sahampati came to him and was like, no, can you please teach out of compassion? There's some people in the world who, have but little dust in their eyes. There's some people who will get it. So can you teach for these people? So the Buddha agreed to do this. And then he just was trying to decide, who to teach. So, he first thought of his previous teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. But it turned out, unfortunately, they had died since the last time he had saw them. So so then he decided, because one of the reasons he wanted to teach them was because he knew they had very developed meditation. They had a lot of wisdom, very, very deep meditation. So for them, it wouldn't take much for them to understand the teaching, for them to become enlightened. But uh, but unfortunately, again, they had passed away, and so he was looking for and thinking about who else, has this type of very strong spiritual potential, who's almost there already, just needs a bit of the right teaching, a bit of right view. And so then he decided to go teach his previous companions, the five ascetics he had practiced with. So after he had practiced with uh, Alara Kamala and Udaka Ramaputta, he went out on his own and started practicing these extreme ascetic practices, and just, starving himself. And, he was just skin and bones and doing all these extreme practices. And he had these five other samanas, or ascetics, who he was practicing with. And when he had given up those ascetic practices and decided to start eating again. And they thought he was kind of going soft, and they that he had given up on the path of practice. So they abandoned him. They split ways, and so he was like, okay, they have this potential. I'll go teach them. So he went to go find them, and so he went all the ways from Bodh Gaya um, to Sarnath, to the deer park at Sarnath where they were staying, which I checked on the map. It's a couple 100 kilometers away. So, he went on foot and went and found them. And so when he was walking up to them, when they first saw him, they were like, "Oh, there he is. There's the guy who gave up," and they were like, "So let's not be respectful. Let's not like show the respect to him as our previous teacher." And so they came up and they ended up, preparing a seat and stuff, but they addressed him just as friend, which is, you'd call your equals or you'd call someone lower. It's not how you would like address someone like your teacher and stuff. So they started chatting, and the Buddha, had told them, actually, I'm enlightened now. I've become a Buddha. And at first they didn't believe him. And the Buddha was like, have I ever said this to you before? Like, out of all the practice we did, like, have I ever said this? And they're like, no, no, actually, you've never spoken like this before. And so they were intrigued and they started listening. And that's when the Buddha started to give this first teaching, this first sermon he did, which is known as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, or the turning of the wheel of Dhamma. So this is the first time he taught, and it's in it is really the heart of Buddhism. So this teaching has, all the really core elements of teaching. I've heard some Ajahns say that, everything afterwards was just commentary on this teaching. So this is the heartwood of Buddhism, of the teaching of the Buddha, of the Dhamma. And so he just started off by first teaching the middle way, which again is very, very interesting that he started with that. He didn't start right into the other things. He started the middle way. And it was also important for the ascetics to hear this because um, they had kind of fallen away from the middle way. So the middle way is to avoid, the path of sensual indulgence, which is kama sukhalikanu yoga, and also to avoid the path of self-torture, self-mortification, which is atta kilamatanu yoga. So to do this middle path between that. And again, it was good for him to say this to these ascetics because they were practicing the path um, of self-torture, of self-mortification. So they had gone off to this one side. And one of the things is, the Buddha was, he was someone you could really take serious when he was talking about this, when he was saying to avoid these two extremes, because he had done them both in his life. He wasn't just talking, everything he was saying was from his personal experience, because, he had done, these practices of self-torture, these real ascetic practices. But before that, when he was a prince, he had absolutely done the life of sensual indulgence. It was said that, he had a different palace for each of the seasons, a rainy season palace, a hot season palace, a cold season palace. He had apparently all the people in one of his palaces, all the like maids and musicians and everything, they were all women. So like he had, he had the sensual desire, indulgence, he had the asceticism, and he was saying neither of these work. They're neither of these is the way to go. You need to go to this middle path. And then he, started teaching, this core of Buddhism, which is the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So, he started talking about, the first truth, the truth of suffering. And and of course, the word we use for it is dukkha. We use suffering, but the actual word is dukkha. So it's this very broad term, everything from real horrible, torturous suffering, all the ways on the other side of the spectrum to like stress, discontent. And he said this is present, that he said there is dukkha, in our lives. And sometimes people misunderstand this and think that Buddhism is just really pessimistic, really nihilistic. All it teaches is that everything is suffering, and people will be like, well, I'm not suffering. I'm not suffering when I'm, say I'm eating a piece of cake. I've got this it feels nice. It's not a suffering feeling to it. Um, but the Buddha, is saying that there is this suffering because you can't get a lasting happiness from that. You get a burst of pleasure from it. You get these pleasurable feelings. The Buddha never said there weren't pleasurable feelings. He said there are pleasurable feelings, there are unpleasant feelings, and there are also neutral feelings. So he never said there weren't pleasant feelings, but he said there is this unsatisfactoriness. Again, dukkha sometimes is translated as unsatisfactoriness to this, because there's no lasting happiness you can get from essential pleasure. These things, they don't give you lasting happiness. Like I always say, you never have that, one piece of cake and it's just so good that you're like, wow, that was the best piece of cake I've ever had. And you never want it again. You're like, well, my cravings for this are done. I'm finished with that. I've fully satisfied this craving. That's not what happens. It's maybe like that for a few hours or a couple days, but then you start craving again. And the story I always love is and I've told I know many times, is the one of Lumpur Cha when he was practicing, and he was trying to test this out for himself. And because the Lumpur Cha, one of the things Ajahn Nando was telling us, that Lumpur Cha was someone who had a lot of doubts. He was a doubting person, and he had a lot of questions before he started to practice, which is one of the reasons why he has so much wisdom, because he had to develop wisdom to overcome these doubts. And so he really loved mangoes, and he wanted to see if he could, if it's true, if you could um, overcome it by indulging in mangoes. So he ate as many mangoes as he possibly could. I've heard two different numbers. I've heard one was, I think it was like 38 mangoes, or another was like in the 70s for how many mangoes he ate. And again, mangoes in Thailand, they're pretty big. They're not small. And he'd eat and eat and eat, and he'd get to the point he'd vomit, but he'd just keep eating more and more mangoes. And he discovered this didn't work. So I'm sure for a few days afterwards, he probably couldn't even look at a mango, but he said it wasn't permanent. The craving for mango came back. So he said, yeah, that's, the way of overcoming uh, craving isn't by indulging it, which kind of leads us into the second noble truth that the Buddha taught, which is samudaya, which is the cause of suffering. And, a lot of times, we think, well, the cause of suffering is because we don't get what we want, or we get things we don't want, and or we're separated from the things we like, or, all these things. But the Buddha said, no, actually, the cause of suffering is craving. It's called tanha. And so he said there's three different types of craving. The craving for sensual pleasures, which is kama tanha, the craving to be, which is bhava tanha, and the craving not to be, or things not to be a certain way, which is vibhava tanha. Which again I think is really great, because sometimes when we think about craving, we only think about it in maybe those first two terms, like I want this, I want to get this, I want to have this experience or something like that. But craving can also be the flip side of it. I don't want this, I don't want it to be like that, and so I want things to be different than they are. So the Buddha was saying that the real suffering comes from this craving. And then so he's got, our problem, which is dukkha, or suffering, or unsatisfactoriness. And then he's got our, the cause of it, what's causing this dukkha. And then the third noble truth is nirodha, or the cessation of suffering. And he said that the way to do this is to give up that craving. So again, like, what Lumpur Cha discovered, you don't do it by indulging the craving and satisfying it. You do it by giving up the craving. And then the way to do that is the fourth noble truth, which is the noble eightfold path. So he broke the path of practice into eight aspects. So there's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, um, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi, or right concentration. And so these can be broken down even further into simplified into three. So wisdom, which is right view and right intention, uh, sila or morality, like our behavior by body and speech, which would be right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And then our meditation, so our samadhi, which would be the right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And it's really good to remember that these aren't progressive steps. So sometimes, we think of it, we hear eight, as, oh, so you go one to eight, or something like that. But that's one of the reasons why in Buddhism, one of the symbols for the Buddhism is a wheel, an eight-spoked wheel, because it's not one factor after another. It's all the factors together, and all the factors end up coming together as our practice develops. So when we're practicing, we can work on developing all of these factors. And sometimes we might have to focus on more at different types. So one time we may be really focusing more on our actions, our morality, our sila. So it's like maybe something like, okay, right now, suppose I had a problem with lying. It might be like, okay, right now I'm going to be really, this is going to be more focused on making sure I don't lie. And then maybe another time in our practice, we might have some more a quiet time, either living in the forest or on retreat. And we might be like, okay, right now I'm going to put more effort into working on the samadhi, really working on that concentration. This is the time I can do that. But we have to work on all these factors together. And so when the Buddha, gave this Dhamma talk, this the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is called the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, or sometimes the setting in motion, the wheel of Dhamma. One of the five ascetics, the Venerable Kondanya, he was able to attain Sotapanna just listening to it. And the reason he was able to do that was, he already had deep concentration. He had been practicing really like hardcore with the Buddha before the Buddha was enlightened. He had his meditation together. He had a lot of like wisdom already. But he just need that little bit, that little extra kick to get him over the edge. And so it's like, like I always say, like Lumpur Biak used to say this, with the Dhammacakka Sutta. He was like, yeah, the Venerable Kondanya, he was able to realize it just listening to it. But he's like, but the monks here, they've listened to it hundreds of times and chanted it thousands of times, and not one of them has attained Sotapanna doing that. So we've got to keep doing the practice. And but yeah, but after that, hearing that the Venerable Kondanya, he attained to Sotapanna, so the first level of enlightenment. So this was really important because before that, it was just the Buddha was enlightened. It was just the Buddha. He had realized it. He had become enlightened. But there was no Buddhism. There was no teaching. No one else knew about it. No one else had discovered the Dhamma. So, he was the only one. So if he had, decided not to teach and was like, no, I'll just I have no suffering anymore. I'll just, chill out until I die, right? And he could have done that, and then there would be no Buddhism afterwards. No one else would have been able to become enlightened at that point. He would have been what's known as a Pacceka Buddha, which is someone who becomes enlightened on their own, but they don't teach. So they don't have a teacher, but they don't teach anyone else. So so he would have done that, but because he decided to teach, and because on this day he did teach like the core teachings, and someone else got it, someone else was able to attain enlightenment. So this was why it was setting in motion the wheel of Dhamma. So that was the beginning of Buddhism, the religion of Buddhism. And on that night, those ascetics became monks, bhikkhus, under the Buddha. And so a lot of times, people will break down the three main holy days we have in Buddhism in Thailand into Buddha Day, Dhamma Day, and Sangha Day. So Buddha Day would be the day that the Buddha was Visakha Puja, when he was born, enlightened, and died. Asalha Puja would then be Dhamma Day, because it was the day that he started teaching the Dhamma and that people were able to hear the Dhamma in the world. And then Magha Puja, because it was all these monks coming together, it would be Sangha Day. But kind of in my opinion, I think in my view is I think uh, Asalha Puja is also Sangha Day because it is the day that the birth of the Sangha. This was when the Sangha started, when there was more monks in the world, where actually it was the community. So in kind of my opinion, it's a bit of a two-in-one day. You've got Dhamma Day and Sangha Day here. But yeah, and then so this is one of the important holy days, which will be coming up in the next few days. And then the day afterwards is the beginning of the rains retreat. So if anyone is making any determinations, any resolutions, any practices they want to do for the 3 months of the rains retreat, that next day is usually the day people actually make the determination and start. No pressure though, but whatever feels best for everybody. But I would like to offer that to everyone as a bit of a reflection for this evening.